Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It by Chris Voss, with co-writing assistance from Tal Raz, aims to provide a comprehensive guide to negotiation theory and strategy, giving you the tools you need to negotiate successfully. Voss's thesis is that good negotiation happens on the emotional level of the brain, not the rational level. Your job as a negotiator, Voss argues, is to practice and display empathy towards your counterpart by understanding their emotions, learning to see the situation from their point of view, and ultimately getting them to feel comfortable enough with you to let their emotional guard down. New section: The emotional basis of negotiation. Voss argues that most people have two basic emotional needs: to feel secure and to feel in control. Successful negotiators are those who can navigate these emotional truths and use them to tap into their counterpart's real desires and fears. The Rider and the Elephant, a metaphor for reason and emotion? Other writers have emphasized just how much emotion, not reason, drives our behavior. In The Happiness Hypothesis, Finding Modern Truth and Ancient Wisdom from 2006, author Jonathan Haidt uses the metaphor of a human rider sitting atop an elephant to illustrate how the human mind works. The rider, representing reason, can do her best to attempt to direct the elephant, but the elephant, representing emotion, is far more powerful and has its own will. It will only comply with the rider's commands if those commands are not in conflict with its desires. This metaphor closely tracks Voss's view of human nature, as he argues that emotion is the primary influence over our behavior. Your negotiating success hinges on understanding the power of emotion to overwhelm reason, and harnessing that power to get what you want from your counterpart, just as a rider harnesses an elephant. Calculated empathy. Make them feel safe. Voss advocates using calculated empathy, understanding someone else's feelings to get what you want from them. Calculated empathy gives you crucial insight into why someone is behaving the way they are. Ultimately, according to Voss, you need your counterpart to feel emotionally safe with you. You want them to see you more as a partner than an adversary. Voss outlines 5 calculated empathy techniques. 1. Active listening. Talk slowly and calmly to show that you're concerned about how the other person feels. Short form note: even small active listening gestures, like nodding your head, smiling, looking in your prospect's eyes, and occasionally adding in short phrases like, "Got it," or "I see," will make your counterpart feel as if you are listening to them. 2. Using the right tone. Use a light and encouraging voice as your default tone to put your counterpart at ease. Short form note: research supports the argument that tone can be crucial to achieving your goals, even in non-negotiation situations, and that using the wrong tone can lead to unfortunate consequences. For example, the highly gendered description of Hillary Clinton's voice as shrill may have played a role in the failure of her presidential candidacy in 2016. 3. Reflecting back. Repeat the last 3 words that the person has said in your next sentence. By imitating their speech patterns, you're signaling to the other person not only that you're hearing them, but also that you're similar to them. Short form note: reflecting back is closely related to the concept of familiarity. Someone who feels this sense of rapport or familiarity with you is far more likely to comply with your requests, because the social costs of saying no to a friend or even an acquaintance are much higher than they are for a stranger. 4. Labeling. Identify and vocalize someone else's emotions through phrases like, "It seems like you're disappointed by what's being offered." Short form note: in Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life, author Marshall Rosenberg identifies emotional labeling as an essential component of expressive nonviolent communication, a way of interacting with ourselves and others rooted in compassion and the conscious effort to avoid causing emotional harm. 5. Accusation audits. List every bad thing your counterpart could say about you at the beginning of the negotiation through phrases like, "You probably think I'm lowballing you on this offer, that I'm trying to cheat you, and that I don't have any respect for your intelligence." This triggers your counterpart's innate empathy and makes them want to reassure you that you're not as bad as you've portrayed yourself. Short form note: although not specifically addressed by Voss, anticipating accusations could potentially be misused if you were to deliberately mislabel someone else's perceptions of yourself, thereby tricking them into expressing empathy for you under false pretenses. New section. Put them in the driver's seat. In addition to making your counterpart feel secure and listened to through calculated empathy, Voss writes that you also need to make them feel like they have autonomy and control over the situation. You need to put them in the driver's seat. Open-ended questions. Voss says you can give your counterpart this feeling of autonomy by asking open-ended how or what questions. For example, if you're confronted with a price that's too high or an offer that's unreasonably low, you would respond with a simple, "How am I supposed to do that?" According to Voss, the key strategic benefit of open-ended questions is that they put your counterpart to work helping you. When you ask an open-ended how or what question, you're putting the other person in a position where they're providing solutions to your problems. Short-form note. In Unconscious Branding, How Neuroscience Can Empower and Inspire Marketing, author Douglas Van Praet writes that an effective tactic used by marketers is to give customers an active role in how they experience and consume a product. They will be more inclined to consume and purchase it thinking that this is an intrinsic choice they're making, but in fact, the positive associations were guided by external marketers. New section. Getting the right responses. After you've displayed calculated empathy and put your counterpart in a relaxed emotional frame of mind, Voss writes that it's important to elicit the proper responses from them. There are certain responses you do and don't want to hear from your counterpart. Even seemingly simple and routine responses like yes, no, and that's right, each have very different emotional weight and mean very different things. The problem with yes. Voss writes that yes is often the fool's gold of negotiation. People often say yes just to get someone else off their back. A false yes does not signal any true agreement or commitment. It's just a way to end a conversation with someone who's being too aggressive and domineering. Short-form note. Why do we say yes when we really want to say no? Some psychologists think it has to do with our innate human instinct for reciprocity. We comply with others' requests because we would want them to reciprocate and comply with our requests if the shoe was on the other foot. Simply put, we have an instinct to follow the golden rule and treat others as we would want to be treated. In Influence, Robert Cialdini calls this the reciprocity principle and argues that it was the glue that enabled social cohesion in early human communities. If another individual brought you some firewood, for example, bringing them some of your own firewood would help the two of you survive and make the overall clan or tribe stronger. This created networks of obligation among early humans that made it easier for the group as a whole to multiply and survive. The power of no. To avoid the false yes and get a real, firm commitment from your counterpart, Voss argues that you need to do something that may seem counterintuitive. You need to get them to say no. Why? Because saying no makes your counterpart feel in control. When we say no to something, it is a way of setting boundaries and demonstrating our independence. To get to know, Voss writes that you need to ask your counterpart questions that are designed to prompt negative answers. You can do this by 1. Deliberately mislabeling their emotions or desires, forcing them to correct you, or 2. Asking what they don't want, giving them a free hand to draw their boundaries and establish their comfort zone. Say no without damaging your relationship. In The Power of a Positive No, William Ury writes about the positive no, a way of saying no to people that doesn't damage your relationship with them or hurt their feelings. Rather, the positive no is a self-empowerment tactic, a way of asserting your autonomy and confidently but respectfully refusing to comply with requests that you don't want to. Rather than giving in by saying yes when you don't want to, rudely and briskly saying no, or avoiding confrontation altogether, Ury recommends the positive no as a way to ground your refusal in mutual respect. For example, if a colleague asks you to stay late at work to finish a project, a positive no would be, "I'm sorry, I can't work late tonight. I recognize that the project is important and I'm fully committed to helping you, but I want to be home to read to my daughter at night, and I won't be able to do that if I'm here at the office. Instead, why don't I move some of my meetings around tomorrow and clear time during the workday so that you and I can finish this project?" That's right, getting affirmation from your counterpart. After you've set your counterpart at ease by giving them the freedom and autonomy to say no, you want to begin the process of bringing them around to your way of seeing things. Voss writes that 2 words from your counterpart can be a great signal that you've achieved this. That's right. When someone says, that's right, it means that they've come to embrace what you've said. They're crediting you with seeing things their way and now feel that they're dealing with someone who understands and respects their point of view. By saying that's right, they've stated their position unequivocally, which you can now use to commit them to your preferred course of action. To get your counterpart to say that's right, Voss recommends summarizing, putting their story into your own words to demonstrate that you really get it. Short form note. Voss writes that that's right gives you a window into someone else's mind by providing you their self-confirmed view of the situation under discussion, which you can then use to commit them to your preferred course of action. This idea of using someone else's stated commitments to steer them toward desired thought and behavior is closely related to what Robert Cialdini calls the consistency principle in his seminal 1984 book, Influence. Cialdini argues that humans have an obsession with sticking to their guns, and that consistency is closely related to commitment. Once we've committed to a course of action or to a belief, we pressure ourselves to conform to that commitment, going through great mental gymnastics to convince ourselves that our current behavior and beliefs align with our past behavior and beliefs, even when they clearly don't. This creates a valuable opening for you in a negotiation. If you can get your counterpart to make even a small commitment, you can potentially get them to make larger and larger ones. New section. Change their perspective. Voss writes that people's behavior and thoughts in negotiations are primarily driven by their emotional needs for security and autonomy. As a negotiator, you need to know how to properly tap into those emotional needs and turn them to your advantage. You do this by switching up their perspective, showing them that by helping you achieve your desired solution, they will satisfy their own hidden wants. Making deadlines work. Voss warns that your counterpart will often try to exploit your anxiety by using deadlines to trick you into suspending your rational judgment and pressuring you to make a deal. But Voss argues that deadlines are almost always arbitrary and flexible, and they rarely trigger the dreaded consequences people fear they will. As long as you're committed to not negotiating against yourself to meet the deadline, this can work to your advantage. You can flip the table and force your counterpart to accommodate your deadline. Short form note. Deadlines are important to negotiations in professional sports. In Moneyball, The Art of Winning an Unfair Game, 2004, author Michael Lewis describes how Oakland A's general manager Billy Beane skillfully exploited Major League Baseball's trade deadline in 2002 to acquire top players from other teams while giving up little in return. Every year, the trade deadline created a time crunch in which losing teams with star players would be desperate to trade off their stars in the hopes of recouping at least something of value. This lowered the asking price for stars and gave Beane the opportunity to acquire players that he could never afford at the beginning of the season. Understand cognitive biases. Voss writes that you also need to take advantage of the powerful cognitive biases that shape how we receive information and determine our best interests. The main cognitive biases Voss addresses are the framing effect. People respond differently to identical choices based solely on how they're presented. For example, the framing effect would make health-conscious consumers more likely to purchase milk when it's marketed as being 99% fat-free versus 1% fat. Short form note. A variant on the framing effect is what's known as the valence framing effect. Research has shown that people hold their negative opinions, i.e., what they're against, much more strongly and confidently than their positive opinions, what they're in favor of. In other words, we seem to dislike what we dislike more than we like what we like. In one social psychology experiment, participants who expressed a preference for fictional political candidate A over candidate B showed a notable division in how they responded to information that their preferred candidate had engaged in corruption. Those who supported candidate A because they were pro-candidate A were more willing to abandon their support in light of this information. Those who favored A because they were anti-candidate B were far more likely to dismiss the corruption allegations and even double down on their support for A. Loss aversion. People fear an equal loss more than they value an equal gain. Knowing this, you can put yourself in a strong negotiating position by framing your preferred solution as one that prevents your counterpart from incurring a loss. For example, If you're making an offer on a house that needs some work, you might say something like, "The house is great, but it definitely needs significant contracting work. Now, I'm willing to waive inspection, but if we take too long, I might have to start looking for other deals." Short form note. In Influence, Robert Cialdini argues that loss aversion is closely tied to an idea called the scarcity principle. The scarcity principle makes things with limited availability more appealing to us. Thus, rare goods are expensive and abundant items are cheap. We're more compelled to buy these goods because we instinctively fear that we'll lose our opportunity if we don't act immediately. You can use this principle to your advantage when negotiating by making your counterpart feel your offer has an element of scarcity. New section. Ensure implementation. Even after you've gotten your counterpart to agree to your terms, there's still one problem. How can you trust them to follow through? Beyond agreement, you need to lock in commitment and implementation. Use open-ended questions to give your counterpart skin in the game. Voss writes that asking open-ended questions keeps your counterpart engaged but off balance. They also force your counterpart to consider your position. This is crucial when ensuring implementation. By asking questions like, "How can I do that?" or "How can we ensure that we follow through on what we've agreed to today?" you transform your counterpart into a partner, helping you solve a shared problem. Short form note. In Getting to Yes, Roger Fisher and William Ury take a more rationalistic, less emotion-based approach to implementation. They argue in favor of negotiating agreements with the success measured against objective standards and performance indicators. When you use objective standards, such as market value or average salaries, you're basing the agreement on principle instead of succumbing to pressure tactics or threats. Watch the pronouns. Voss writes that you can observe your counterpart's language cues and speech patterns to see whether or not this person is truly integral to the decision-making process. Specifically, Voss warns, be on the lookout for their use of pronouns. The person really in charge seldom says I or me. Instead, they deflect to third-party pronouns, saying things like, "We'll have to see if that's a realistic path forward for us," or "We'll have to review internally before we can commit to anything." Short form note. A recent study out of the University of San Diego, surveying over 90,000 conference calls, found that CEOs who used first-person singular pronouns received a better response from investors, who found that the use of these pronouns demonstrated honesty, responsibility, and empathy. Conversely, those CEOs who leaned heavily on pronouns like us or we were more likely to be found by investors as craven, weak, and trying to evade accountability. This points to a possible difference between how leaders speak and how people interpret them, and may indicate a limitation of Voss's theory, since leaders who are aware of people's preference for I pronouns may use them for that reason, nullifying Voss's technique. Spotting a liar. Sometimes you're going to come up against a dishonest or unscrupulous counterpart. Voss writes that liars tend to be more verbose and use more complicated, rambling sentences, hoping to draw your attention away from the web of dishonesty they're weaving around you. He says they also use more distant third-person pronouns like they, them, and we. They tend to avoid saying I or me. Psychologically, this helps the liar distance himself from the lie. Short form note. Voss writes that liars rely heavily on third-person pronouns, but we've also seen that people in positions of power do the same thing to avoid being pinned down to a definite position. Both are examples of deflection, but they are not the same thing. If you're talking to a CEO, for example, and you notice that she's using a lot of third-person pronouns, you shouldn't immediately jump to the conclusion that she's lying or trying to mislead you. Instead, she may be trying to deflect in order to avoid being too tied down to any particular course of action. That's her being strategic, not dishonest. In order to distinguish between the two scenarios, keep asking open-ended questions, watching for tonal and nonverbal cues, and listening for key bits of information that your counterpart might reveal. New section. How to bargain. Voss writes that beneath the offers and counteroffers that are part of any negotiation, there is a swirl of deep psychological currents that drives our hidden wants, fears, and desires, and those of our counterpart. Your job as a good negotiator is to construct an accurate psychological profile of your counterpart so that you can be better attuned to what they're really looking for. The three types of negotiator. Voss identifies three main types of negotiator. Givers, people pleasers who tend to be highly sociable and agreeable, but also poor time managers. They'll often agree to things that they can't actually follow through on, since they're so eager to make you happy. Calculators, methodological and diligent people who want to assess all the facts before committing to a decision. As a result, they're fairly unconcerned with time and less likely to be pressured by deadlines. Aggressives, highly achievement-oriented people who prioritize getting things done. They hate wasted time and care a lot about meeting and beating deadlines. Short form note: other analysts of negotiation have identified different negotiation styles. At Harvard's Program on Negotiation blog, they list four main styles: individualists, cooperators, competitives, and altruists. Individualists are purely transactional, focused on their own return on the deal, and show little interest in helping their counterparts achieve their goals. Cooperators are those who strive to help all parties to a negotiation accomplish their objectives. Competitives are primarily concerned with relative outcomes, wanting above all to do better than their counterparts, whom they often see as competitors and even enemies. Altruists are a rare breed, who are most concerned with ensuring that their counterpart gets what they want, even if doing so comes at their own expense. Know your moves and your counterparts. Voss cautions that you need to be prepared before you head into a negotiation, regardless of which type of negotiator you're dealing with. That means you need to think about your open-ended questions, how you're going to reflect back, and your labels before you go in. You may not need a script, but you do need a plan. There are some specific dodge and counterpunch moves you can use when facing down a seasoned negotiator. Dodging tactics. This is what you do to deflect your counterpart's punches. You can use open-ended questions to say no without actually using the word or pivot to non-monetary terms. Ask questions like, let's put price aside for now. What else can you offer that would make this a good deal for me? Short form note: some negotiation analysts have written that switching the conversation to non-monetary considerations can be an effective technique for negotiators dealing with a larger and more powerful counterpart. They suggest that you can restore some balance to the negotiating environment by appealing to principles like your counterpart's sense of fairness and reputation, or by emphasizing the unique non-monetary advantages you can offer, like agility, knowledge, or personalized service. Counterattack. You need to be prepared to hit back without getting angry. Voss champions a technique psychologists call strategic umbrage. This means being genuinely angry, not faking it, but in control of your emotions. The key to strategic umbrage is getting angry at the offer being made, not the person making it. Saying, "I'm afraid there are no circumstances that would make what you just proposed work for me," in a displeased but measured tone, is a good way to leverage a little bit of anger to your advantage. Short form note: many psychologists argue that anger itself is not a positive or negative emotion. When used appropriately, anger can power professional success and fuel personal creativity. Instead, the key is to harness that anger to serve useful purposes in situations where it can actually make a difference. This is another way to think of strategic umbrage: angry, but in control. New section: Unknown unknowns. Finally, Voss stresses the primacy of having information. Indeed, he says that at their most fundamental level, all negotiations are exercises in information gathering, but some pieces of information are easier to obtain than others. Voss writes that in every negotiation, there is some hidden piece of information that, if it were known, would completely transform the dynamic of the negotiation and the final outcome. He labels these black swans. Unknown unknowns, black swans. The most important pieces of information, according to Voss, are the unknown unknowns. These are the bits of information that we lack, and crucially, don't know that we lack. These are the black swans. For example, let's say you were looking to buy a house from someone. If, in the course of your negotiation with the seller, you discovered that they were facing some sort of external financial pressures from a lawsuit or a job loss, you would have great leverage over them. This information would tell you that your counterpart was a highly motivated seller who would likely accept a heavily discounted offer from you. This is a black swan, something you didn't know before, didn't know that you didn't know, and that completely reshapes the negotiating dynamic. Voss highlights some important tactics for finding your counterpart's black swan. Get FaceTime to pick up verbal and body language cues. Voss argues that too much is lost with impersonal media like email. Short-form note. Although Voss couldn't have anticipated this when he published his book in 2016, the COVID-19 pandemic made it difficult for business people to conduct in-person meetings and negotiations, with such gatherings largely moving to virtual platforms like Skype, Microsoft Teams, and Zoom. Working with other people without the benefit of face-to-face interaction created a number of pitfalls, including inability to see the totality of a person's body language, since they usually just appear as talking heads, difficulty of making direct eye contact, which inhibits trust building, and a heightened awareness of racial, ethnic, age, and gender differences between ourselves and our counterparts, since video conferencing enables us to simultaneously see ourselves and the other person, something that doesn't happen with in-person interactions and that may subconsciously force us to lean back on stereotypes. Exploit the similarity principle. Voss writes that decades of social science research shows that we are more likely to trust people whom we see as similar to ourselves. This concept is known as the similarity principle. Voss advises you to look for what you have in common with your counterpart. Build a rapport with them and create a conversational, even confidential, atmosphere. Short-form note. The similarity principle can also be used for nefarious purposes, unfortunately. Con artists often practice a form of deception known as affinity fraud, in which they target and exploit members of their own age, racial, religious, or other identity group. Their exploitation is effective because their victims see the con artist as being someone like them, which causes them to feel a level of trust and let their guard down in a way they might not with someone they perceive to be an outsider. Speak your counterpart's language. Voss writes that black swans also give us key insight into how our counterpart sees the world. Once you know this, you've cracked the code. You can speak to them fluently in a language they understand. This helps you avoid the mistake of thinking your counterpart is crazy just because you don't understand their behavior. Short-form note. Voss's argument that irrational or inexplicable behavior by a party in a negotiation is often the result of their poor information speaks to a concept known as information asymmetry. In Freakonomics, authors Stephen Levitt and Stephen J. Dubner write that information asymmetry occurs when information is unequally distributed between parties. This has major implications in a negotiation, in which experts will rely on knowing more than the other party to extract value from them.